I'm Vinod Sharma. I'm Senior Professor of Disaster Management, and today we will discuss about the cyclones. And I will give you a case study of Odisha super cyclone in 1999. Cyclones, as you know, that India is vulnerable for cyclones, and every year in Bay of Bengal, 3 to 4 cyclones are formed. Now with the climate change, the frequency of cyclone have increased, and we have about 7,000 kilometer area, in the east coast, which is highly vulnerable. In the west coast also nowadays there are cyclone formed, and in this year also you might have been knowing that there is Nisarg cyclone was formed which hit Mumbai, and there was not much damage, but cyclone was there and impact was seen by the city. This Odisha super cyclone, which was there on 29th of October 1999, this is a very, very important cyclone in the history, and that's why we want to discuss it in detail. We will also discuss how the cyclones are formed and why the cyclones are formed and why it is they are so damaging basically. This is very interesting phenomena. If you see that when the sea layer become warm and the upper layer is having less temperature, and if there is a 2 degrees Celsius temperature in the upper and lower layer, then the depression starts, and this eye which will be formed, then it will be a deep depression, and ultimately a vril will be formed. And because the cyclone is a Greek word basically, which means the cyclic, which is the coil of a snake. So that's how the cyclones are formed. And when the warm air which is having some moisture, when it goes up, the cool air cannot take that much of moisture, so it become condensed and form clouds. The wind velocity is a very important factor here, and when the just depression or low pressure formed, the wind velocity is not very high. It is about 30 kilometer per hour. But when depression is formed, it becomes 50 kilometer, and then it changes. There are 5 categories of cyclone, and the 6th category is super cyclone, when the wind velocity is more than 210 kilometer per hour. And Odisha super cyclone was one where the wind velocity was very high and the damage was enormous. This was why we discussed this cyclone, because after that the entire paradigm shift was observed in India. The disaster management, because we find that the state was not prepared. And for the first time we could see that the capital was affected. Earlier you take any Andhra Pradesh, which is very much vulnerable for cyclone, Tamil Nadu, which is very much vulnerable for cyclone, the capital never affected by cyclone. But for the first time Bhubaneswar was affected. In fact, 12 coastal districts of Odisha, there was enormous loss, and nobody could visit the affected area for several days. This was the disaster 29th of October when it happened at 10 o'clock in the morning. In fact, Honorable Raksha Mantri, Defense Minister, wanted to go and visit because but he couldn't fly. His helicopter couldn't land, So he tried next day, it couldn't happen. So for 3 days, nobody could go from center, and third day it was possible to reach to Bhubaneswar. So I think this was one disaster. When the landfall happened, this churned the whole 12 district. For 3 hours together, it was stalling at one place and churning, all the places. So the agriculture was affected, the houses were affected, the animals, I think enormous loss we witnessed in Odisha super cyclone, and that's why we say that this was one very important disaster to discuss, and many lessons can be learned from it. We could see for the first time that because when any cyclone happened, there were tree felling is very common, and Odisha was not prepared. So the Andhra Pradesh, forest officers from Andhra Pradesh, they entered and they start cutting, trees which were felling on road, and they cleared the road basically. So this was the assistance which was received by Odisha from Andhra Pradesh. Then similarly, West Bengal, the first assistance came from West Bengal in terms of food, rice, etc. And so this was the first case where the interstate cooperation was seen, and that was not planned. In fact, we say that planning is so important. In case we are planned, in case there is interstate cooperation, then many things can be solved. Even the center was not prepared, they never imagined that there will be communication gap, because just after cyclone there was absolutely no communication between center and state. The only communication means was satellite phone. So he tried to contact Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, Chief Minister of West Bengal, and Prime Minister of India. And he couldn't complete his call because the battery was off, and satellite phone was there, but it was not charged. And so we realized for the first time that how important is communication. There was a total darkness, the electricity failure was there in the whole state, and not only in the coastal area, but even the Bhubaneswar was affected. There was, if you consider life loss or people affected, it was enormous. Official figure is 9,985, but I am sure that the death was much more, because I witnessed that. I was there in Bhubaneswar for 15 days to document it, and we learned a lot from this disaster basically. The entire, you can learn about preparedness, you can learn about relief mechanism, you can learn about response. Any aspect of disaster management, I could see that it was an open laboratory for disaster management. So my learning, if I know little bit of disaster management, it is from Odisha super cyclone. There was another factor which nobody is considering, that just 18 days before there was another disaster actually. In fact, 12 days before. On 18th of October, there was another super cyclone, the intensity was not that big, but it was very big, and about 280 people died in that, about 1.5 million people affected by that, several districts, 2 districts, mainly affected, and people thought that so soon this big, cyclone will never come to Odisha. So this was the people's perception, this was the perception of the officers, and that's why people were just relaxed, though the IMD was giving this information that there will be a big cyclone, but people were not taking it seriously. So this is one. Then when it happened that the whole country, I should say, there was no state which has not helped Odisha. There is no NGO who have not gone to Odisha and helped the people. I think for few days it was total chaos. Nobody was knowing where to receive, relief. So in United Nations office, UNICEF office was converted into UN house, and they did coordination work. And government people, they also, helped them in coordinating that how this relief should go to different 12 districts and who will be in charge of what. The young officers of Odisha, they did marvelous job. They took their own computers and they reached to Kalinga Stadium they opened their offices, over there. And after few days, I will say after a week or so, it was channelized. And Kalinga Stadium was one place where all the relief was received. Then it was distributed to different districts, and there was a full-fledged mechanism. And I will give full marks, to the officers, and particularly the young officers who did huge work. They did marvelous job in relief, in rehabilitation of Odisha later on. But initially there was no preparedness, and that's why the importance of preparedness. In case you want to just study preparedness, this is a very good case study that about the vulnerability assessment, about the resource inventory, about the even the warning system. IMD was giving warning, but that warning was not taken that seriously. So I think all those things which are important, the public awareness, the police was giving this warning to the coastal area, but people were not listening. So I think all these aspects of preparedness we learned from there. Mitigation, again very important, and structural, non-structural, what is required. After this cyclone, I think Odisha become example of fully prepared state. If you compare it today, from 99 and to 2020, I think there is a huge difference. And today Odisha is having cyclone shelters. The people, they are aware. They have a very good mechanism for rescuing people. They have good mechanism, to removing people from the coastal area. And this time in 2020, when Amphan was there, I think Odisha government did marvelous job. And that's why if you compare that what has happened in 20 years, I think the state is on top list of preparedness. And it is not only cyclone. I mean, this preparedness can be used in floods, this can be used in earthquake, this can be used in any other disaster. And that's why we give example today of Odisha and Odisha State Disaster Management Authority. So we will be discussing this in detail, that the preparedness aspect, the mitigation aspect, the response aspect, even the animal, because after that we realize that animals are also very important. We don't think that only human life is important, but cattle life, for the first time we realized the wildlife, that this kind of cyclone, the Kaziranga and all these, they were affected and the wildlife was disturbed. So even that aspect, we know today that this is the important aspect. So I think we will be discussing cyclone, but I think for any other disaster, Odisha super cyclone example can be taken. And I always say that my learning of disaster management is basically from this natural calamity. Thank you.